This program is brought to you by Colgate. Brush twice a day for strong, healthy teeth.
Good evening, welcome to Simpson at 8. Pacific Island Forum trade ministers are meeting this week to discuss economic issues and challenges and progress on regional trade agreements, the Pacific Island Countries Trade Agreement, PICTA, and the Pacific Agreement on Closer Economic Relations, PESA. Also being discussed are economic partnership agreements with the EU and Pacific ACP countries. The trade ministers meet amidst a range of global challenges, including the China-US trade war, the threat of the coronavirus, climate change, and other challenges that Pacific Island economies are particularly vulnerable to. Joining me this evening to discuss these issues and more is Professor Jane Kelsey, Auckland University Professor of Law, specializing in Pacific trade. She is currently in the country to observe the trade ministers meeting. Jane, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here and see you again, Stanley.
Thank you. Now, I want to take you back to 15 years ago, in 2004. You wrote a report, Big Brothers Behaving Badly, the implications for the Pacific Islands the implications for the Pacific Islands by the Pacific Agreement on Closer Economic Relations, PESA, which is now PESA Plus. Now, in the report, you stated how Australia and New Zealand were in essence bullying Pacific Island countries into these trade agreements and of the possible negative impacts. 15 years on, are the big brothers still behaving badly when it comes to trade?
Sadly, leopards don't change their spots. During the negotiations of the PESA Plus agreement, we saw some pretty unreasonable behaviour, following old patterns, old presumptions that this is our lake, words actually used at the time. But the European Union was as bad when they were negotiating the EPA. What we have seen recently is a shift in the rhetoric in Australia and New Zealand talking about a Pacific reset. And that's because they now perceive they have competition from China. You know? And so suddenly, now that there is some competition, they are reinserting themselves more actively in the region. But the agenda hasn't changed.
What were some of the patterns of behavior that you observed, for instance, like in the PESA Plus, that went back to some of the issues that you raised in your last report?
Some of it was simply really bad behaviour, bullying behaviour in the negotiating room. But more fundamental problems of resource inequalities, the ability of large teams of negotiators from the EU, Australia or New Zealand, backed by consultants that they often paid for, who'd written reports for Pacific Island countries or for the Forum Secretariat, and relatively small teams of trade officials and ministers who weren't nearly as au fait with the issues on the table. I'm pleased to say that has changed a bit. I've been really impressed with some of the trade officials that I've been speaking to, and the level of understanding of some of the ministers. Ministers change.
In the Pacific.
Yeah, in the Pacific. And ministers change, and they're politicians, they're not engaging in the nitty-gritty of these negotiations. I would like to say that the Forum Secretariat has changed, but I'm afraid it is still as inadequate in servicing the needs of Pacific Islands countries.
What do you mean, in terms of expertise?
In terms of expertise, in terms of independence, in terms of actually going and looking at what are the fundamental needs of Pacific Islands countries in addressing trade questions, as opposed to following the same old pattern of the templates of agreements and going to the same old consultants.
All right. So, you're saying that in some ways the Australia and New Zealand are a bit more engaging now?
Yeah, but not necessarily for the right reasons. I mean, if we look at Australia's position on climate change, which is appalling, and despite the fires that have ravaged the country over the summer, there's not a great signal that that's going to change. I mean, thankfully New Zealand's position is a bit better. But if you're looking at Pacific countries and trade issues, you can't use the same old template rules. You have to address what are the fundamental challenges of climate change. And if you're a climate denying country, then you're not addressing the questions.
So those are some of the fundamental issues, and those are very deep issues that people that we need to go through. But PICTA and PESA, when it was announced and launched in the early 2000s, it was seen as a game changer. Pacific Island countries have to get into it, or otherwise you will drown and die, and you'll be left out of this, the development and the economic progress that's happening around the world. At the moment, PICTA has been ratified by 12 of the 14 countries, but only 7 have implemented. And that's the one that only involves the Pacific Island countries. Yeah. It doesn't involve Australia and New Zealand. Now, PESA, which is now PESA Plus, only Australia and New Zealand and Samoa have ratified the agreement. Tonga, I understand, is going to ratify this year. Why so slow? What has been the concerns? Have Pacific Island countries woke up and realized it's not going to be really in their favor?
I think it goes back to 2 things. One is the model was never going to be the right model for Pacific trade development.
What do you mean when you say model?
There is globally a kind of template that all of these agreements follow. And they've been developed over many years, mainly from developed industrialized countries, and they are abstract and technical, and they make assumptions about the kind of production there is in countries, the kind of size of countries, the capacity of countries to be able to engage in various kinds of trade, and that the best approach is that you simply reduce your taxes on imports and then magically there's going to be economic development. And that model hasn't worked in other countries either, but it's certainly not an appropriate model for the Pacific. So with PICTA, you had consultants come in with a version of this template. PICTA and PESA. PESA was the promise to do a similar agreement involving Australia and New Zealand and not just Pacific countries. That becomes PESA Plus based on the same model. The EU uses the same model in the EPA. What's happened with the EPA? Same things as PICTA and PESA. MSG, same model. Yeah? And so I put one of the reasons down to the fact that the model itself is broken.
Right.
Yeah? The second reason is that the Pacific Islands countries are now so much more aware of the issues and the implications and have much more backbone than they had in the early stages of those negotiations.
Right. So one question people will ask, what are the alternatives to this model? Because it's a global economics model that underpins global trade and capitalism and global economy at the moment. Is there really any way you can work outside of that model?
Well, there absolutely has to be, because if we look at what's happening in the world at present, that model is collapsing. Right? The World Trade Organization is in chaos. It may barely survive the ministerial meeting at the middle of this year because there are such fractures there between rich and poor countries. You've had backlash even in the US and in the UK in relation to Europe, but you've got this sense that this model is creating inequalities, it's creating inequalities within countries, between countries, not adequate to deal with climate change. Digital issues are now on the fore, which are not addressed here. And so there has to be a rethink. And countries like, regions like the Pacific, and countries like Fiji that have real potential have to work out what a different model looks like.
Yes, and even in some of the developed countries, there's a backlash against this model. I mean, some of the issues that even Donald Trump raises and some of the more protectionist policies happening around the world. But before we go to the break, negotiations for trade agreements, they generally take years and they are painful, protracted processes. So for Pacific Island countries like Fiji, when negotiating these trade agreements like, say, PESA Plus, EPA, and the rest of the Pacific, what would be some of the key issues that they need to fight for and to be mindful of? And try to hold on to?
There are priorities that countries have. Obviously, Fiji, sugar is an issue. Yeah? And I don't think Fiji would have signed the interim EPA if it wasn't for that historic relationship with the Europeans on sugar. And now they've got a question because the UK is actually the main trading partner for Fiji, and the UK is leaving the EU. How is that relationship going to get reordered? And I'm sure that the Fiji officials are thinking very specifically about what is the trade-off that might be required for the protection of sugar. Fish is a similar issue.
But that's really mostly what we have to trade with.
And one of the concerns that I have, including in talking to officials and ministers this week, is that they are the immediate focused issues, sugar, fish. But the systemic parts of the agreements, the ones that lock in the imbalance, that lock in the dependency of Pacific Islands countries and that provide the multiple gains for the bigger players, they're not so much on the radar.
All right.
And that's the problem of some of these big agreements, that we'll give you sugar or fish, but this is the rest of the deal.
There's a lot of other things that you have to come with, that you need to agree with, that can be very painful. You're watching Simpson at 8. Don't go away. We'll be back to discuss the EU and Pacific ACP countries' negotiations after the break.
This program is brought to you by Colgate. Brush twice a day for strong, healthy teeth.
Continue to watch movies on the big screen with Colgate Monday Movies. Simply buy one movie ticket and present it together with one empty pack of any Colgate Total toothpaste or a Colgate 360 toothbrush and get another movie ticket free. Now showing in Damodar cinemas near you. Promotion begins 15th January and ends 15th November. Conditions apply. Check in-store posters for more details.
This program is brought to you by Colgate. Brush twice a day for strong, healthy teeth.
Welcome back. You're watching Simpson at 8 with Professor Jane Kelsey, talking about the trade ministers meeting and the trade agreements that are being negotiated by the Pacific Island countries and development partners. And obviously the big one on the table is the EPA, or Economic Partnership Agreement, between the EU and Pacific ACP countries. How do you see the progress on these negotiations? Because there's a sense of fatigue and frustration you can sense that has seeped into these negotiations with the talks. It's been going on and on, almost like going round in circles, some would say. What are some of the key concerns or some of the issues that you've pulled out with these talks and where it's going?
With the European Union, the Pacific is in a way a bystander, because the European Union's game plan is part of the Africa, Caribbean and Pacific group, the old colonial countries with
the
which...
old Lomé Agreement, as many in Fiji
Yeah, the
remember.
Lomé Agreement that became the Cotonou Agreement. And of course Africa is the big prize for the EU. The Caribbeans did the first agreement last time, and the Pacific was slow, cautious, but also the Europeans weren't that interested, except they didn't want to set a bad precedent by accepting something low. And I think one of the really encouraging things over those negotiations here was that especially Fiji and Papua New Guinea came out very clearly with a sense that this was an uneven playing field and they were going to tread very cautiously. And I think many of the other countries have learnt that lesson as well as they move into what's now called the post-Cotonou agenda, because Cotonou agreement terminated in 2020. Yeah. And we've now just got the new mandate that's come out from the Commission. And it shows that the European Union is going to be totally aggressive, right, Its mandate includes almost all of the things that were in the EU-Canada agreement, right? Like the old Cotonou agreement, it has rhetoric about development, but the real hard rules will be the rules that work for the economic interests of the EU.
So what are some of these rules?
And one of them that worries me intensely is on investment, and for guarantees of foreign investors from the European Union, if they invest in the Pacific and not only have rights of not being discriminated against vis-a-vis locals or other Pacific countries or other countries, but that if you regulate in a way that affects their profitability and the value of their investment, whether they're a mining or a fishing company or a tourism operator, then the investor can sue the Pacific government for not just their investment they've made to date, but lost future profits for the anticipated term of that investment.
That's quite harsh.
And that case, and in many instances, it's been many, many hundreds of millions of dollars.
This many instances are in where? In Africa?
Asia, Pacific, Europe, Africa, Latin America, many of them over issues like water. You know, privatized water operations, mining operations. Sometimes there have been cases that have been designed to what we call chill governments. We'll bring a case if you don't back off. And one of the most evil things about this is that the cases aren't heard in your courts. The cases are heard in arbitration tribunals that are offshore, run by private arbitrators. And the European Union has a big thing about this, which is why it's in this new agreement, that they want to set up a global investment court to hear these cases. Not to change the rules, which are totally pro-investor and anti-sovereignty. And so that is one of the key things that it wants in this agreement.
Because I'm listening to that, and we hear our leaders, our economic ministers talking about we need foreign investment, we need to put in place policies to facilitate foreign investment. And you're stating some of these agreements, they may let you have access for the fish and the sugar into their countries, but they could be very problematic for Pacific Island countries in the future.
Absolutely, and the research that's been done show that these agreements do not attract investors. Investors make their decisions in your countries for a variety of reasons. And the problem of these investment agreements is that they're totally one-sided. There is no corporate social responsibility. There are no binding environmental
But you
rules.
see those things mentioned in the trade agreements.
Oh yeah, but they're rhetoric. And when you're facing questions like climate change, which is one of the biggest investment issues here, how are you going to deal with many of the challenges of foreign investment coming in, but you'll need to regulate them and to change that over time because of the climate change challenges. And the threat of an investment dispute is
hanging over your head.
Horrendous.
This is what the Permanent Secretary for Industry and Trade for Fiji, Shaheen Ali, stated regarding the EU ACP negotiations, Pacific ACP negotiations. He said, we need to question the current balance of our relationship with the EU when considering committing to the EPAs and negotiating the successor to the Cotonou Agreement. The EU has been a crucial development partner in the region. However, they have also taken harmful unilateral actions in declaring some of our tax jurisdictions unfavorable and our fisheries unsustainable. Going forward, we would like to see a change in the dynamics of our relations, which should be based on mutual respect and equal partnership. Can there really be a change in the dynamics, and will the EU budge?
Of course there can be, and I think that statement from Shaheen Ali is a good signal to everybody that the time of being pushed around is over, and that the EU might have its model, but the priorities have to be determined from the Pacific. And if they don't work for Fiji, then the EU has to make some decisions. Yeah? Is it going to compromise? Because always the compromise has been on the other side. Yeah?
So you're saying it's time to be pushed around is over, but can we push back? Do we have even the capacity or thing, given we are small, and the question minute says we need them more than they need us?
Well, that was the case, but there is another card in the Pacific Pac now, and that is China. And just as Australia and New Zealand's Pacific Reset is a response to China, and the US renewed interest in the region is a response to China, so the EU is going to have to balance that question.
Right. There's a cat among the pigeons have arrived.
And so the bargaining power is now, it's different because Pacific Islands countries, Fiji especially, is now more able, more capable to deal in these negotiations on an equal basis.
Because of that card?
Because no, because they also have more skill base,
That's
more
right.
capacity, and then they have the ability to play that card in a room in which they now are there.
Because
as
there are
equal
some
players.
real concerns, I mean, from the other developed countries about China.
Yes.
And we will go to the break now and discuss that when we come back after the break.
This program is brought to you by Colgate. Brush twice a day for strong, healthy teeth.
Continue to watch movies on the big screen with Colgate Monday Movies. Simply buy one movie ticket and present it together with one empty pack of any Colgate Total toothpaste or a Colgate 360 toothbrush and get another movie ticket free. Now showing in Damodar cinemas near you. Promotion begins 15th January and ends 15th November. Conditions apply. Check in-store posters for more details.
This program is brought to you by Colgate. Brush twice a day for strong, healthy teeth.
Welcome back. You're watching Simpson at 8. We're with Professor Jane Kelsey talking about trade, Pacific trade negotiations with developed partners. This is another comment from Permanent Secretary Shaheen Ali that caught my attention when it relates to China, as we were discussing for the break. He said, we need not limit ourselves to our traditional trading partners. We need to harness the opportunities presented by the Asian region. In fact, the center of the global economic gravity has moved towards the Asia-Pacific region. Therefore, we need to develop regional strategies to approach and engage these markets. Now, when we mention Asia, there's really one giant market that stands out, and that is China. How does China fit into the current trade negotiations, as we talked about earlier, with the Pacific? I mean, it's a game changer.
Yeah, it's a game changer because of its size and because of its different approach, a different relational approach, less arrogant, more talk about development. But at the same
Really?
time,
I mean,
yeah, but at the same time, China is not benign.
That's right.
Right? And New Zealand, for example, has a free trade agreement with China. And New Zealand was focused on how do we get more dairy products into China. And China was more focused about how do they make sure that there is a resource chain from including buying land, the production of the dairy to the processing to the sales in China. And what we have ended up with is a situation of huge dependency on the Chinese market. They are by far our largest market, not just in agricultural exports, but in tourism and in education. Now, you know, that was a bit of a problem when there's a bit of a recession in China, but now with the pandemic in China, those chickens are coming home to roost, and we're seeing just how deeply dependent and vulnerable we are. So there are lessons in that for Pacific Islands countries as to how to manage this relationship. Balancing off, strategically playing off with the other big players is important, but also not becoming so dependent on China's patronage that you can't make your own choices. You can't exercise your sovereignty.
Loss of sovereignty. That is one thing. And then is one question people will say when they say, yes, China may be great, but look, we have a long relationship, we have stronger ties with Australia and New Zealand. Doesn't that count in terms of when we're making decisions about who is best to deal with?
Well, it should, and hopefully it will change the behaviour of Australia and New Zealand. But we're not seeing a lot of that yet. And as I said, it's not simply in the questions of how do you negotiate agreements and are they totally asymmetrical like the PACER Plus is. It's a total outrage. And the labour mobility issues are shunted off to the side. But how are they going to deal with integrated questions like climate change?
So this is an opportunity for Australia and New Zealand to really be meaningful in their engagement and something that's mutually beneficial.
Absolutely.
into the agreement. So you've talked about China's growth in the Pacific. They've come in, you know, obviously. How have you seen this growth? And you've talked about it a bit, but I'd like you to just explain further. How would you recommend the Pacific approach China when dealing with China?
With caution. The Belt and Road initiative from China, which is their big infrastructure development project, including funded by the Asia Infrastructure Development Bank, is a really big opportunity, but it also is a potential nightmare in terms of levels of debt, but also quality control of construction and so on. And so governments need to temper their enthusiasm and excitement with real caution, not just about the extent of exposure, but looking at the legal documents, says the law professor. Because what I mentioned earlier about the right of investors to bring disputes against governments if governments change the rules, if, say, Fiji allows in a very large amount of Chinese investment and then decides that there are some problems about that and want to change the rules, so some of those investors can then sue Fiji under these contracts that will have been signed in the offshore tribunals. So there's a real level of caution and balancing.
And managing the what you sign on to.
Yeah.
Being careful. So one of the reasons also, you know, apart from the China game that's there, one of the other reasons that the EU and the others say, oh, Pacific, we can't change this trade agreement because we have to follow World Trade Organization rules. And in particular that, you know, have a level playing field that they say. But as we know now, you mentioned earlier, WTO is in chaos. Even Donald Trump is saying it's unfair to his country. What are some of the key issues then that within the WTO that the Pacific Island countries need to be mindful of? And can they really make change, you know, to have a stronger say in the WTO as a developing countries bloc?
Well, of course, there's only 6 of the countries that are members of WTO, and WTO has never been a level playing field. WTO was the creation of rich and powerful countries, predominantly the US. Especially since China joined, it's not working for the US in the way it was. The US wants to remake it. Developing countries agreed in the early stages to this unlevel playing field with the promise that it will be levelled up over time in what's called the Doha round of negotiations. Those have gone nowhere. Now rich countries have gone back and said, we're not going to finish that. We want new issues on the table. We want electronic commerce. We want investment facilitation. We want these matters dealt with because they're important to us. And we want to redefine who is a developing country. So at present, you have India and China and South Africa and Brazil being defined as developing countries. The US and some others want to say, you cannot do that anymore. You big ones, we're not going to let you do that. Now, that's not going to affect Pacific Island countries' designations. You're still going to be least developed countries or developing countries. But it means the big players who you used to rely on to fight the battles for you won't be able to do it as developing countries.
We won't be by your side in a sense, yeah.
So these are key issues that will be at the ministerial meeting of the WTO in June this year. And it will be make or break. And Pacific Island countries have a really important role to play in having a voice to defend their interests as developing countries with the unfinished development agenda in the WTO.
How can they do that?
They can do that firstly by becoming informed at national level. I've been very concerned that because the WTO operates out from Geneva and sometimes from Brussels, same with the EU negotiations, the level of knowledge of officials and ministers at national level is very low. And part of what I've been doing this week has been talking to them to try to get them a bit more up to speed and provide information. Other countries, South African ambassador was at the event last night. They play a very important role. Dialogue between them and the Pacific Islands countries are important. But it needs to be done by the governments, and I think by the governments in capital. The Forum Secretariat needs to butt out completely. It needs to be governments exercising their sovereign rights and responsibilities in the WTO.
All right, that's interesting because many say the strength is in numbers, and that's what the forum provides, you know, an integrated, putting the 16 countries in as a bloc.
Well,
won't they be stronger together rather than,
when we're dealing with
being on their own?
When we're dealing with WTO, it's the 6. Right? And the strength will be, yes, if they work together, but if they work together with other countries, and with other countries that have a common interest. Yeah. And not all of those are, the ACP group in the WTO is not good. Yeah? So it's a matter of finding strategically who is going to work in the interests of small, vulnerable economies. Yeah? And you know, those discussions need to take place. The forum is not the place for that. The forum is not engaged in Geneva. The forum is many countries that aren't part of that. And the forum, as going back to where we started this conversation, back with PICTA and PACER, the forum has not served the interests of Pacific Islands countries in the area of trade at all well.
In terms of, I mean, there'll be a lot of pushback from people in the forum on that, but you're saying in terms of the model that they're trying to push onto... In terms of the model, but also in terms of their level of openness to providing information, to meeting, to listening to criticism, to taking on board alternative views. PANG, that was the entity that commissioned those early reports on PICTA and PACER, has done great work on this. Their technical expertise is as good as any of the governments. And the Forum Secretariat needs to be open to
hearing those views and to taking them on board.
I want to end on an issue that you raised that's on the WTO, which is on e-commerce and digital trade, which some see also, as I've been using this word a lot, game changer.
Yeah, yeah.
But it is, because given our isolated location, high business costs, high shipping costs, transportation costs, what are the challenges and opportunities presented by e-commerce and digital trade, which is more or less a new thing or new emerging industry, so to speak, in the Pacific? So where do you see this going, the issues and the challenges?
The 21st century is going to be dominated by the digital platforms, ecosystems, etc. Yeah? Old ways of doing business, whether it's retail or tourism or education or even health services, but even things like mining and forestry, and so, all of that is run by digital technologies. So the fundamental question is, who controls that ecosystem? Who controls the search engines? Who controls the data? Who controls the financial and payment systems? Who controls the digital platforms that SMEs want to sell on? And it's the big players.
Yeah, we know who owns
It's what
that,
we call
yeah.
GAFA, Google, Amazon, Facebook,
That's
and
right.
Apple and others. And the problem we have is that they have got to the US some years ago and said, we want global rules that stop countries from regulating our activities. And they got those in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the TPP. That has been transferred into other agreements. It's on the EU's agenda for post-Cotonou, and it's what's being argued for in the WTO. It's pitched as e-commerce for development. So all your small enterprises can sell their stuff on Amazon. Well, that's not going to happen. Sadly, unless there is investment of time and resources into what we call digital development and digital industrialization in the global south, in developing countries, develop your own capacity, your ability to control the data.
Otherwise, so that can be done?
You're dependent again. Yes, there's initiatives that are starting. India has some good programs. Rwanda has a great program. South Africa has a really good program. And so we're urging countries, for those of us who work intensely on this, not to sign up to rules that will handcuff them, but to start working together on development of alternative digital strategies that can have massive opportunities.
Okay. Very heavy stuff.
Sorry.
But it's great to have a discussion on this. Jane Kelsey, thank you for joining me on Simpson at 8.
My pleasure, Stanley.
Thank you. That was the show for the evening. Join me again next Thursday at the same time. Good night.
This program was brought to you by Colgate. Brush twice a day for strong, healthy teeth.
Continue to watch movies on the big screen with Colgate Monday Movies. Simply buy one movie ticket and present it together with one empty pack of any Colgate Total toothpaste or a Colgate 360 toothbrush and get another movie ticket free. Now showing in Damodar cinemas near you. Promotion begins 15th January and ends 15th November. Conditions apply. Check in-store posters for more details.